Okay, everybody, we'll make a start this evening. You're all very welcome. It's great to see everybody here, and it's nice to see a good crowd here tonight for David Ryan, our speaker. David is going to talk to us about oral history and using that in genealogy research. Now, I just want to give you some information about David, tell you a little bit about David. David is a professional genealogist in Cork. He runs the Ryan Genealogical Services company and is the founder of that. He has also worked as a pro-genealogist at Ancestry. He was a census enumerator for the most recent census. He has worked with the Oral History Network. Is that right?
The Oral History Network of Ireland. I'm on their steering committee.
Yes. And he is a UCC graduate with a diploma in genealogy, as well as just having graduated, I think only a couple of weeks ago, from UL with a master's in public history. So he's very well educated, I can tell you. He served on the APG, the American of Professional Genealogists
the Association of
website.
Professional Genealogists. They're worldwide, not just
it
American.
is worldwide. Even though it's American, it says American. It is worldwide. You've served on various committees.
I'm still a board member.
A board member. And he has also spoken virtually at Roots Tech, which is a very well-known genealogy conference there in Salt Lake City. I will turn it over to you, David. Thank you very much. And we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, well, thank you all for having me up here in Clare. I'm from Cork, and I got started in my own experience with oral history. Came about a few years ago. I worked for the Cork Folklore Project for a few years, and the manager of the project, he's still in charge of it, is a Clare man, Dr. Tomás McConamara, which I think nearly all of you would be familiar with. So trust a Clare man to teach Cork people how to do oral history. I was certainly lucky to learn from Tomás. And what got me interested in oral history, of course, was that crossover with genealogy and with family history. Because as we all know, when you're doing any sort of family history or local history research in Ireland, there are so many gaps in the written record. Or there are so many times when the official record tells you one thing, but everyone local knows, no, actually, this is how it actually happened. So what is oral history? Trying to define oral history can be tricky. There are a lot of different definitions out there. I would say that oral history is it's about memory. Yes, it's certainly a more personal form of history. It can exist in video. There are a lot of great, documentaries that rely on oral history. And most will probably encounter it mainly in audio format. For example, I know that here in Ennis you have Genealogical and Clare Memories Project, which I believe are based here in this building. They do a lot of oral histories, and of course when it comes down to sort of the older oral histories, a lot of that would be in a written format. So there's no typical format in which we find oral histories. So certainly there is, for family history, oral histories can be invaluable because they are a living history of those unique experiences. And I'd often say with oral history is that you could interview two people from the same family who grew up in the same house, lived together nearly their entire lives, but yet both of them would have a completely unique remembrance of that history. And, that is invaluable because, history, it's not something static. It's not something that can necessarily be pinned down into one format. And it's certainly an opportunity for those people who've been hidden from history to have their voices heard. And this can come in a number of formats. Just as soon after I came in, there was a gentleman telling us about some oral histories of local fishermen. And these are sort of histories that you're probably not really going to find in sort of, a big history book or really talked about outside of the local community. But yes, those histories are invaluable just for understanding the local area and just sort of what sort of roles people had in their communities. And then, of course, there are also women's histories, as we all know from trying to research female ancestors. A lot of time, there's information can seem to be very scarce. And so that is where oral history can actually be really, really useful. Certainly for me, one thing I loved about doing oral histories was actually getting to sit down with somebody and talk with them face to face and actually get their perspective on history. Because it's when it comes to, say, genealogy, a census record might tell you who lived in a certain area, but an oral history will actually tell you what life was like. So it suddenly opens up that. So like an oral history might be able to tell you, Ryan's up the road. Oh, sure, they had a very hard time of it. Half their livestock died one year, and then there was a bad flu that carried off their youngest. And of course, these are the sort of things that you may find a death record, but it won't tell you how did it actually impact the family. And of course, it's that new insights and perspectives that can challenge how we see the past. But for example, like recently we had the decade of centenaries, and there was a lot of new research done on the War of Independence, on the Civil War, and that, in some respects, that challenged the narratives that people had built up. Some people may have thought, gone around for years saying, "Oh, our family we're staunch Republicans always," and then maybe it turned out that they had a great grandfather who was in the RIC, and so sometimes oral history might actually allow people to open up about aspects of their own family history that they hadn't really been comfortable with in the past. And of course, as I said, it allows us to see the human side of historical events. So we see beyond just plain statistics and numbers. We understand how did people actually experience what happened. And if you're doing family history, genealogists, when people come to me now, they can find lots of the official records online. But what they really want is they want that local perspective. So they want to know, well, what was life like for my ancestors in Cork? And sometimes, I would be able to point them towards oral history as a useful resource. Of course, can we trust oral histories? And I'm sure we've all found when it comes to doing our own family history and with local history, some types of history are seen as more equal than others. Up until recently, there seems to be a bit of a divide between the sort of more official academic histories and then what was seen as sort of the amateur local history. And of course, some people will say, "Oh, well, you can't trust oral history because it's people lie, they make mistakes." But of course, as we all know, I think, we all know from family history, we'll have found someone in our own family or researching someone else's. We'll have found, either, someone who managed to age more than 10 years between 1901 and 1911. We'll find someone who put themselves down as a widow on the census when full well that their husband had taken off to America or Australia, and was living with another family off over there, or even just, the most common one, we'll find someone who was, officially born on a certain day, but yet their baptismal record has them as being, a month or two older. So, again, even the written records can lie to us. And, so, I would say, we can trust oral history as much as we can trust any historical record. Now, and this way I'd say, when you're using oral histories, approach it like you would any other source. Always have a degree of skepticism about any type of historical record. Just because it's a written or oral record doesn't necessarily mean that it is more trustworthy than the other. A lot of oral histories now will usually have some sort of supporting documentation. It might be a transcript. A lot of oral history projects would have some sort of log kept by the interviewer, which might just have a bit of extra information. I know when I worked for the Cork Folklore Project, sometimes we created a transcript, but we usually, at the very least, just create an interview summary, which would just sort of have, the main points from the interview, simply because, like transcribing a 2-hour interview would take you most of the week. So it's much easier just to summarize it. But even in that summary, we would usually have sort of little notes, which might just, provide a bit more context on something that somebody said. So, if you're interviewing somebody, say, about local fishermen, they might only use nicknames for the family. So it might, you as the researcher might have to actually, go into the transcript or the interview summary and add sort of little footnotes, just sort of, this is this family that they're referring to. This is where they're actually, where they're from. So, don't just rely on the actual audio recording or the transcript. Check to see, is there something else that was created alongside it? And I would say oral histories work best when you use them as an overview for a period or a theme. So they may not necessarily provide you with the sort of immediate snapshot that, say, a census record would, simply because, of how memory works. It's not like, say, a flashback in a movie where, somebody will sit down and say, oh, well, yes, I remember these events that happened on the 5th of February. It was, 10 past 2 p.m. This was the exact temperature. Our memory doesn't work like that. Usually we'll sort of, we'll tend to remember more in terms of emotion, of sort of like, well, it happened on such a date, and this is what I was feeling at that time. You're not necessarily going to remember sort of, exact details. And it's the same with stories. It says that, memory isn't necessarily infallible. And the further back we're trying to remember, like, there might be a certain memory from our childhood that seems fixed. And yes, I said, when I talk about, interviewing people who maybe grew up in the same household, you could talk, probably you could talk to one of your siblings and say, no, it didn't happen that way. No, it happened on, completely different day. It actually was raining. It wasn't sunny. It was in the middle of winter, not the summer. And this is who was here, and, so on and so forth. So, how we remember, so memory can be tricky like that. It's, it's not necessarily like a film strip where it's, exact. We tend to remember things more in terms of emotion and sensation. So sometimes, you'll hear people say this, a certain sound might bring back certain memories, or a certain smell. And so, I also would say with oral history, particularly when it comes to Ireland, because the Irish, we're masters of not saying things sometimes. And of course, I'm sure we've all found that with older generations, particularly when looking at the events of, say, the War of Independence and the Civil War, that there was a lot of things that people didn't want to talk about. And even just in terms of, general memories, that's like I know my own grandparents. My grandfather would start talking about something that he remembered from his childhood growing up in the rural South Tipperary, and then he'd stop and say, "Oh no, I can't tell you about that because someone from the village will hear that I've been talking about it, and then they'll come knocking on the door, and they won't talk to me again." And it might not be necessarily anything controversial. It's just, sometimes it's the small things that people won't want to talk about. And of course, I suppose that comes from just living in such, close-knit communities. So, just, be aware of what people don't say when they're speaking. And that's why it's so invaluable to do it face-to-face and to have it actually recorded, because there's a tendency sometimes when people are transcribing an oral history to sort of, to tidy it up. They don't necessarily write it down verbatim. They just say, "Oh, well, there's a bit of a gap here. I'll take that out just to tidy it out." So, be aware of that. Of course, there are obviously, a lot of challenges to using oral history. So, we've all found that stories will change a lot as they pass through the generations. So I'm sure we've all had, say, a certain story that's been passed down through the family. Maybe there's a story of a relative who stowed away to America or something like that. And then once you start researching the story, and you'll find that they didn't even get as far as America. Maybe they only got as far as Limerick or something like that, and got homesick and turned around. But they spun a story to their family to make themselves feel less foolish. So, and there's also the fact the stories they can change as they're passed down. Again, I said because of how we remember. Always be careful of exaggeration. Now, I will say that in the time I spent doing oral history interviews, I never came across anyone who I felt was being deliberately untruthful. But there will have been people who maybe they exaggerated their role in a story more. And of course, that's natural. Especially if we're telling something that came to us second or third hand, it's human nature to maybe try to improve it a bit. It's something that's sort of unconscious. And often I find when people are telling stories of something that happened in their childhood, like as I said, like stories of someone who said that they stowed away to America and only getting as far as Limerick or the next parish or something like that. It's just it's human nature. And oral history, I said, oral histories are best sometimes when they're used as an overview of certain events or locations. Quite often with the Cork Folklore Project, we get an email for someone doing research to say, "Oh, do you have any oral histories of such an area?" And I might go into our archive and say, "Well, okay, we have this person who was interviewed, say, down near Skibbereen." And yes, they may not mention Skibbereen once in the interview, except maybe in passing. And it was simply just because of how the interview took place. So, maybe the interviewer just never asked any questions focusing on that, or maybe the interviewee just didn't think it was that important. Maybe I'm sure everyone knows everything there is to know about Skibbereen already living around here. It's far more important that I talk about my time working as a local guard or spent, working up in Dublin or something. So as I said, it's simply the way of how people are, or even they may not just mention anything specific. And of course, you are dealing with a personal recollection. And I said that personal recollection might differ from the official sources. There might be a newspaper article which, completely contradicts what they're saying. There might be a neighbor who has a completely different story. That is, oral history will nearly always be a personal recollection. And because of how memory works, we don't always remember things exactly as they happen because there are so many things which influence how we think about the past. I said, like, emotion is a major part of it, and we tend to build up certain associations around certain memories. So, for example, like, say if you're asked about your first teacher in primary school, you're probably going to remember them. Oh, I remember that. Oh, yeah, she was ancient. She must have been nearly in her 90s. And then you'll go back and look at the records, and it'll turn out she was only like 30 or 40. But simply because of how to a 5-year-old, anyone older than you must be ancient. That's simply because of how we think about the past. And you should also be aware that if you're looking at oral histories of traumatic events, they can also be very upsetting to you as the person listening to them. Something like, I know that in recent years there's been a lot of oral history done with survivors of institutions such as mother and baby homes, industrial schools, etc. And some of that can be quite difficult to listen to. So it's just to be aware of that. If you do encounter something upsetting, don't force yourself to listen to it. Just be sure to try to maybe take a step back and maybe say, I'll come back to that in a few weeks when maybe I'm better able to handle it. Now, there are, of course, a lot of very useful types of oral history, especially when it comes to using it for genealogy. So, these are some of the themes I'll be looking at, but there are, many, many, many more. So, I'm sure you're all familiar with the schools collection. I love dipping into the schools collection whenever I have an excuse. And I always try to find some way of using it for a client. Even just to say to them, well, look, this is as far back as I can go on your family history. But if you want to get a bit more local history on the area, you should really look at some of these. And of course, they were collected by school children. Some of them are better than others. Like, I found that even some of those which are collected by my own relatives, there are times when I can tell you the story seems to jump around a bit. And you'll find, sometimes almost the exact same, there are, I'd say, hundreds of stories about buried treasure somewhere in the locale. And, and times they'll almost seem to be, verbatim. That you wonder, did they just, find this, in a book? Someone said, I'll copy this and I'll say that my grandparents told me. But what is valuable for this? This was collected by Tessie Hyland, one of my mother's aunts. And I always remember Tessie as just being this, when he seemed to be born old. I always remember her as being a very old woman. But what I love about this is that, she would have been about 7 or 8 years old when she collected this. She collected it from her grandfather, John Hyland, and you can see his age there. And then, and so suddenly I'm back 2 more generations. And this branch of the family were they were staunch Republicans. They got themselves into a lot of trouble in the 1930s, always getting into scraps with the local blue shirts. And for a long time, I could not find the death record for this John Hyland. I knew when he was born. I know he was born in the 1850s, but I could not find his death record. His death did not seem to be registered. So I was kind of stuck, well, do I, have him on the 1911 census? I know that, I know when some of his, grandchildren were born. So do I just do sort of, a general search for every John Hyland who might have died between 1911 and sort of, 1950s? But knowing what year this was collected, knowing what age he was, suddenly it is much, much easier to narrow it down. And, his wife also wasn't, gave a few stories to this. And, again, her death record wasn't registered either from what I read. Again, I don't know whether it was just, they didn't trust the Irish state at the time or what it was, but just, having this was just so valuable. And actually, this John Hyland, he lived until 99. He died only a few weeks short of his 100th birthday. And he died he fell down the stairs one day. So if only for that, he probably would have seen his 100th birthday. But yeah, the school's collection is it's amazing. And even just the general folklore collection, there's so much in, the National Folklore Collection that you could spend, weeks just getting lost in it. So as I said, where possible, I always tried to find some excuse to send something that's in this onto a client. Military oral histories. As I mentioned, I was trained in oral history by Dr. Tomás McConamara. Tomás has done so much on the War of Independence and the Civil War in Clare and even just around Ireland in general. So the Bureau of Military History is a brilliant resource, because even when one of your own relatives didn't actually, wasn't interviewed for it, you would probably find some mention of if they were involved in the Republican movement at any point, there is a reasonable chance that they will be mentioned in the Bureau of Military History, because of course the Bureau of Military History was important because it was connected to people, people wanting to get their pensions for involvement in the movement. So, and that of course did lead to some people maybe exaggerating their role, when they were only sort of acting as a, maybe just a messenger, that they'd say, oh, well, I was present at such an ambush and I personally shot half a dozen Tans and so on and so forth. So, sometimes you will find those little contradictions in the witness statements. But yeah, the Bureau of Military History is amazing. I found some references to my own family members in there who were involved in the North Cork IRA during the War of Independence and would have served under Liam Lynch. Of course, the one drawback of the Bureau of Military History is that typically it will not cover the Civil War. Because of course, when this was taken, people just didn't, it was still, the wounds of the Civil War were still just too raw. People, they just didn't feel comfortable speaking about it, which of course is a shame. And so we had sort of, I think it's only relatively recently that people have been willing to open up about it. But of course, the military archives it's not just War of Independence oral histories. They actively continue to collect oral histories from serving members of the Irish Defence Forces in all branches. So if you've had someone who was connected to the Defence Forces at some point, even if they were just in the reserves or the local defence forces in the 1940s, there may possibly be an oral history there that could give you a bit more information on their experiences. Now, migration stories. For genealogy, we'll all have some family members who immigrated at some point. People have always been constantly coming and going. So the Ellis Island Oral History Project is, I think, possibly one of the biggest oral history projects, and it really doesn't get spoken about that much, which I think is a shame. There doesn't seem to be a lot of awareness about it. And it was like, I only came across it by accident a few years back, because there was one of the project managers, I think, was speaking at Roots Tech or something like that, and she mentioned this, and it was like, why isn't this more widely known? So it is, it's, you have passengers, you have family members, people who actually worked at Ellis Island, some of those who were detained for whatever reason. And, so, a lot of really useful stuff there. And it's, it's all pretty much all online as far as I know. So if you are trying to find some information on family who passed through Ellis Island, or even just, kind of curious about, well, what would they have experienced going through there? Because, of course, like in Cork, we're very proud of our connection to Annie Moore being, the first arrival to actually go through Ellis Island. But we don't always think, a lot of the time about what was it like for them, like to be processed, what, sort of steps would they've had to go through, even just the journey on the boat. Because a few years back, I interviewed a gentleman who is he was the organist in St. Colman's Cathedral in Cove at the time, but his maternal grandfather had been the postmaster in Cove. And as well as delivering the post out to the ships, the postmaster would sometimes have had to actually act as a chaperone for children going out to join their parents who'd gone ahead. And he had the story of, these two children from rural Ireland in the 1920s. And they went on, they were brought on board the ship, and they were terrified by the electric lighting. They had absolutely no experience of electric lighting before this. And it was just they were completely horrified by it. And you're not going to find that in any sort of official record. Because LSI will just say, yep, these are these two children, they're going to join their parents, this is where they came from. That's it. There's nothing really there on the actual journey. So that's why those oral histories can be invaluable. And then, of course, there are the hidden histories. I already mentioned about how women's histories tend to be overlooked. And one of the projects that I did for my master's was looking at oral history collections belonging to religious orders, particularly nuns, the Presentation Sisters in Cork, because a lot of time, there are certain groups where actually, we know all about them. We sort of, we have a stereotype in our head, or maybe we had a family member, maybe there was an aunt or something like that who was one of the religious orders, and we don't really think much about them. We just think, there's almost this view that, they went into the convent, and as soon as they took their vows, they became old women. So, this particular project with the Digital Repository of Ireland is absolutely fantastic because, you have this period, 1930, 1960, and the working lives of women, because often there is, again, this assumption that actually, women, they were there, they were keeping the home, that was it, and that, they didn't really work until, the 70s and 80s. But of course, that isn't the case. There have always been women out there in the workforce in some capacity. It's just that, because of how history was passed down, we didn't really hear their stories. So, the Digital Project of Ireland they have a number of oral history projects. They're not necessarily always that easy to find, simply because of how the DRI archive is organized. They don't have a simple drop-down menu that tells you, okay, here are all our oral history. So you sometimes have to search around a bit. Finding oral histories can sometimes be quite tricky, because what often happened is that, so you'll have someone local who've gone out, they'll have done a bunch of interviews, they'll have gone into a book, but the original recordings may have just, maybe they were just kept in a box in someone's attic or in a storeroom, or they were sort of just, shoved into a cupboard somewhere. And they kind of get forgotten about. And it's even the same with, more modern oral history, stuff that's recorded digitally, that people weren't always very good at thinking about, well, what happens to these afterwards. I've put together my book, it's out there. What am I actually going to, what can I do with the recordings? Libraries and archives have gotten much better at being willing to take these in and catalog them. Some museums have oral history collections. Again, like a lot of libraries and archives in the past, they don't always know what to do with them, because a lot of the guidelines for museums tend to focus on the physical collections. There's tons and tons of training for museum professionals out there on how do you care for, this, Bronze Age relic, or, like a piece of, somebody's, a jacket from, 100 years ago or something like that. Until recently, there hasn't necessarily been as much on how they look after their ephemeral collections, and sort of, how will they use them. So, but they are gradually starting to get better. So, like National Place Museum in Cork, because of the nature of their collections and the fact that nuns don't leave behind a ton of physical artifacts, they had from the start had to incorporate oral histories. 14 Henrietta Street and Dublin also use a lot of oral histories as part of their tours. And more and more museums are gradually coming around to incorporating oral histories. But it's still, still relatively early days. You'll probably find universities tend to almost be the biggest repositories, because so many academic disciplines rely on conducting some sort of oral history. Certainly, it's when I did my master's in public history, nearly all of us would have been encouraged to do some sort of interview. And then, of course, some universities had their own sort of, internal oral history projects. Like UL has an oral history project interviewing faculty and other members of staff, so it's for sale. Again, sometimes it'll just be, it'll be buried in their collections, and they may not even be aware of what they have. Local societies such as your own, it's quite common for people to undertake some sort of project, saying, what, we're going to interview like local fishermen or people involved in local crafts, and we're going to put together a publication or an exhibition or something like that. So And then of course, the Digital Repository of Ireland they're probably becoming the biggest collector of them nowadays, because a lot of people are turning to them in order to preserve their local digital collections. Now, what do you do if you're planning on conducting your own oral histories? One of the biggest questions that I tend to get is, what sort of technology should I use? People kind of think that, do I need to run out and buy a really expensive recorder, or like a really fancy digital camera? And I said, it comes down to what sort of interview are you planning on doing? If you're just doing sort of an interview with a family member, that's it's probably you're probably going to be the only person to listen to it, and maybe sort of kept within the family. Then in that sort of situation, a smartphone is fine. Like most modern smartphones have some sort of recorder app on them. But if you're doing it as part of a project and it's going to some sort of archive, then they may have certain criteria on the audio quality. So there'll be a lot of discussion about file formats. Like if you're recording something on your smartphone, usually it'll be in MP3 format, which again is fine if you're using it for your own purposes, if it's not really going to be shared more broadly. But again, the difficulty with MP3 format is that it's compressed and it loses some of the quality. So what a lot of the digital recorders do is they record in .wav format, which is uncompressed, so it takes up more space. And when I worked for the Cork Folklore Project, the way we did it is that there were two copies of the interview created. The original archival quality, which is in .wav format, and that sits in the archive, it's untouched. And then you had the public version, which would be MP3. So if we needed to say, take a small clip out of something to put on social media or for an event, we could take that from the MP3 version. And just, the original archival version sits there untouched. It's similar with video. There are all these, different formats. So just, be aware of the audio quality when you decide what sort of recorder you want to use. And it's very easy nowadays to actually find affordable audio recorders. You don't need to be spending hundreds of euro on something unless it's for very specialist purposes. Again, how easy is it to export the finished recording? Like most modern audio recorders have, a little USB slot, or you can say the memory card and slot it into a laptop. Unless, like a smartphone will often upload it to the cloud where you can just, download it straight away then. So it's, make sure that whatever technology you're using, you can find your way around this easily. Don't necessarily, don't be sort of pushed into buying something that has all the bells and whistles, and then you have this great interview and you have absolutely no idea how to get it off the recorder afterwards. It is very, very important, whatever method you use, be absolutely certain that you have some sort of external storage. For the Cork Folklore Project, we operated on a rule of 3. So there was the external drive, which we had in the project, which we could get whatever we needed from. And then our archivist, he'd have his own backup, which he stored at home. And then Tomas, our project manager, would have his own copy. So, there were 3 external hard drives out there, 3 different brands. So that if one developed the fault, hopefully it wouldn't be something that was replicated in the other 2. And I'm sure it's probably something similar that you have with the society, that recordings of the lectures. I'm sure Paddy has a backup somewhere else. So always make sure that there is some sort of external backup somewhere. Don't just keep it on the recorder and think, sure, it'll be fine. And then you come back to it a few years later and the file has been corrupted or something like that. Now, if you're planning on doing an interview, it can be tempted to think, actually, it'll be fine. It's not rocket science. I'm just going to dive right into it. First thing you should do is look for training resources. At the moment, there are actually a lot of different groups offering training. I know here in Clare, Cork, Clare Memories, they do training. Tomas, who I've mentioned several times, does some training. The Oral History Network of Ireland, we offer a number of training workshops. There's a lady living out in Ackle Island, Dr. Angela May Bunbury, she does training. So there's a lot of different training out there for oral history. And for a lot of people, what they really just need is something to help them kind of get over that initial nervousness. That's right. Once they've had a bit of practice, they can, fly into it and it's fine. Like with genealogy, for like any of you who do research for others, I think we've all learned by experience that before you sort of agree to anything, you'll do a bit of research beforehand. Just, okay, well, is this viable? Is this something that I can actually take on? And that is especially true for oral history because, if you go into an interview completely unprepared, you're not necessarily going to be sure what to ask, or you may find yourself asking something that, to the person being interviewed, they'll end up looking at you going, are you tick? Why are you asking me that? So you may end up asking someone from, East Clare about, do you have any experience of, say stuff that happened in West Clare? And they might look at you saying, well, what has that got to do with me? Are you sure I'm the right person for you to be interviewing about this? So, it is always useful to do a bit of research in advance because that can help guide your questions. And you might find that say, oh, well, there's no point asking them about this because they've been on the local radio for years talking, they've repeated this story over and over again. Let me maybe come at it from a different direction. So maybe you might, instead of asking them, oh, what happened on such day, you might ask them, well, how did you feel about what happened? So doing a bit of research can maybe allow you to cover ground that hasn't been covered before. I always find it's a very good idea before doing it just to write down, maybe not even a list of specific questions, but just some topics that you want to talk about. And, feel free to share that with the person that you plan to interview. Because, anyway, I suppose one of the big differences between, say, oral history and journalism is that when it comes to oral history, you're not looking to catch somebody out. You're not trying to say maybe, here's the local politician, he's always a bit smug. I'm going to try and trip him up now by asking about something slightly embarrassing. When you're doing oral history, the goal is to get somebody to open up, to be willing to share with you. So if you ask them about something that maybe they're not comfortable speaking about, they might shut down, and you might suddenly find out, well, we're only 10 minutes into the interview, and they're not going to tell me anything more. So, it's just polite. Again, just, say, okay, well, here are some of the things that we want to talk about. And it also maybe allows them to say, it's been years now since I thought about that. But you know what? I have this box of photos upstairs under the bed. Let me fetch them. And then suddenly, that's opened up a whole new area of conversation. So, it's just, again, it comes out to communication. By making sure that the person you're interviewing is comfortable, they will be more willing to share with you. And again, this has happened to me. It's probably happened to almost anyone who's done any sort of interviewing. Make sure your devices are fully charged. Are there fresh batteries in there, or has been plugged in overnight? Is there enough memory free on it? It's just, these are the things that can actually, that will trip people up quite often. That even nowadays, when the memory cards are like several hundred gigabytes or sometimes up to a terabyte, you'd be amazed just how quickly things can fill up, or just how quickly you'll go through the battery. I'm sure we've all had this where we suddenly realized our phone is on 10% charge and it's only halfway through the day. I won't be home until tonight, so I'm going to have to I'll have to switch it off and hope to God that nobody's trying to get hold of me in the meantime. Now, personally, I have found this when you're doing the interview, it's no harm just, sit down with them and have an informal chat. This can be a good time to go over some of the questions you want to ask. Maybe just have like a cup of tea, just relax, because it helps put them at ease. Because for some people, being interviewed, it can be a very daunting and nerve-wracking experience. Because they might be stressing out, oh God, what if I say something now that's going to come back to haunt me in a few years down the line, or if I remember something incorrectly, all of these minor things. It's very, very important to make sure that the interviewee knows that they are being recorded. It is common courtesy, but there might be certain things that they don't want on the record. And, it can be tempting, you're at a family gathering, someone is starting up with, the story they always tell, you might think, well, let me just slip the phone out here while they're not looking and, press record, let me get this. But, always make sure that somebody is comfortable being recorded. And that just might be a case of, when the interview starts, okay, we are recording now, so on and so forth. Just say it out loud, because it's not always, some recorders, it's not always obvious. Make sure that you have a quiet and comfortable space that you can use. Maybe like might be the living room, might be the kitchen, it might be somebody's office somewhere. Just somewhere that, if needs be, unplug the landline, all phones either switched off or on silent. Make sure that there isn't like a radio blaring in the background or anything like that, or that, anyone else in the house knows now not to come barging in trying to find something they left in the room. So, just, make sure that it is quiet and that everyone is comfortable, especially you, because if you're fidgeting and moving around, it's going to distract the interviewee. They're going to be thinking, they don't really want to be here. Maybe I'm wasting my time telling them this. I don't say, try not to be too rigid. even if you have your list of questions and topics, if somebody goes off in an unexpected direction, don't be afraid to say, oh, that's really interesting. Do you mind if we talk about that for a while? Now, maybe they might actually tell you about, I spent a few years off in, living in London, working on the building site. You'd be saying, I never knew about that. Why didn't you tell me about that before? I was saying, no one was interested. So, just sometimes, you can get such valuable things when you sort of, go off topic. And, like when I worked for the Cork Folklore Project, some of the interviews that had been done when the project started, the interviewer, they had a script. And there'd be some interviews where you'd be screaming in frustration because, the interviewee did reference some really interesting story, and the interviewer just, on to the next question. They just wouldn't take the time to, they had their script, they're sticking to it, that's it, and they weren't interested in exploring anything else. So, and there might even be something where you say, that's really interesting. We don't have time to get into that today, but would you be willing to do another interview where we can actually talk about this in more detail? So, it's just all of these. So until you sit down with someone, you never know what sort of story that you're going to get from them. Now, ethics is extremely important, and consent, as I said, don't record someone without their permission. So when you're sitting down to do the interview, if it's just like a personal family interview, oral consent is probably okay, but it is important to make sure that the consent is recorded on the interview. So maybe just at the start of the interview, say, it's such a day, I'm David Ryan, I'm interviewing Paddy Waldron on some aspect of Clare local history. Paddy, you're okay being recorded. It's just just that common courtesy. And if it's sort of a more formal project, then you will have written consent form. And the purpose of that is just to make sure that the person being interviewed is aware of their rights. And, and especially with GDPR, there's a lot of extra stuff that has to go onto it. But what the permission form will usually have is there'll be some sort of period where the person being interviewed has the right to withdraw their consent within sort of usually a number of weeks or months after the interview has been taken. And because you will find that someone might say maybe they're okay being interviewed at the time, but then they think about it and they say, did I say such a thing about somebody? What if it gets back to them? And often what you'll find is if somebody is worried about that, and they might say, what, can you get rid of the interview? You might say, well, what if we just take out that section? Would that be okay? And you say, yeah, that's fine. And that'll be kind of redacted for a certain number of years on the public version. So, again, like, what I say about being aware of any concerns or conditions that the person being interviewed has. So, and that's why you should make the list of question topics available in advance. Just because you might say, well, I'm not really comfortable talking about this topic. I feel it's too soon, or there's somebody else who I feel knows a lot more about that, and I just feel foolish trying to talk about it. Be very clear on why you are doing the interview. Is it going to be used in a book or an exhibition? Or are you just doing this for, sort of like, keeping it within the family? So, who is going to have access to it afterwards? I would always say, be very careful about putting an interview out online straight after it's been done, at least not without telling the person you've interviewed why you did it. Data protection, of course, GDPR is a major factor nowadays. It can seem like a headache at first, but it is very important. So, for example, when I had to do a number of interviews as part of my master's dissertation, and UL has all these rules about, okay, this is how long the interview has to be stored for, this is how it must be stored, and so on and so forth, which, again, is important. If you are looking for, what, sort of an oral history permission form might look like, you can find sample ones available from the Oral History Network of Ireland. There are others that are out there that are used by the Oral History Society in the UK, the Oral History Association in the US. There are a lot of different versions out there that you can customize to suit your needs. And I'm sure, Kilrush and Clare will have their own permission forms that they'd be, happy to let you, use as a template if you needed to. And the most important thing, and sort of one of the hardest, is to actively listen when an interview is taking place. Because it's when you're having a conversation with someone, you always feel as you need to show a response. You're sort of, you're kind of half listening while you're half thinking about, what do I need to say in response to this now? Or maybe, you're thinking about, what do I have to get from the shops later? Or, and what am I going to cook for dinner? You're only kind of half there. But if you're interviewing someone, you have to stay engaged. Because I said, if you look like you're drifting off, or if your body language is basically telling the person you're interviewing that you're not really engaged, they're going to pick up on it. And they're going to maybe say, well, why am I bothering? They're obviously not that interested. So learning to listen can be one of the hardest parts. And sort of best practice when it comes to doing oral history nowadays is, except for when you're asking questions, to try to only respond non-verbally, to almost just sort of nod and just, right, yeah, right, just try not to interrupt. Only interrupt when you feel it is absolutely necessary. Maybe try to ask a follow-up question, or maybe try to steer somebody back on topic. So learning to listen is a skill in and of itself. There are a lot of great oral history resources, a lot of whom I already mentioned. So that's Folklore Collection, Military Archives of Ireland, GA Oral History Project. I know Clare people are mad for their GA. Unfortunately, the GA Oral History Project, hopefully someone will pick that up and continue it in years to come, because it's such an important aspect of Irish life, and particularly when it comes to that local history. The Irish Women at Work Oral History Project I talked about briefly, was Raised Ireland Oral Histories. I came across that when I was doing trying to find some local oral histories to talk about. So when it comes down to training, I say the Oral History Network of Ireland, we have a number of different training that's out there available. Most people just go for the oral history interview basics, but then there's kind of more advanced material. For example, we've done a number of workshops with the Digital Repository of Ireland on archiving oral histories. There are workshops on ethics. If a local community group gets in touch with us and said, right, we want someone to do oral history training with us, we try to tailor it to what they feel they need. Digital repository of Ireland, anything to do with digital archiving, the DRI are invaluable. ACL Oral Histories, the head of their project, Dr. Angela May Bunbury, she does a lot of training. Kilrush and Clare, I believe they've done a few workshops with people there. Of course, Tomas McCalmara, there's a lot of training and auditing of oral history collections as well. So, this is a fantastic time to actually be doing oral history because there are so many of these resources available to you. So, thank you for that. I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much, David. Very comprehensive overview of oral history and all the resources there. Particularly the Ellis Island is something I didn't know anything about. Now, we do have to be out of here by 9 o'clock, but if there's a couple of questions, I'm happy to take them. Would you be happy to take them, David?
Yep,
just
of course,
a few questions
yes.
there. Does anybody have any questions? No. Yes.
Yep.
You mentioned the Ellis Island Oral History Project. Is that interviews with people who? Does that include interviews with people? Does that include interviews with people who went through Ellis Island?
It does, yeah, it does.
Like you can get the Ellis Island records on various other websites. Like
Yes, it does actually include interviews. Like they'd be primarily like 20th century interviews, but still they would be useful because we've all had people in our families who would have emigrated in recent generations and probably would have passed through Ellis Island.
Yeah, thanks.
It's a very good, I agree. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Anyone else have any questions? Everybody okay with that? Yeah, very comprehensive. Thank you very much, David. Really appreciate you coming down coming up to see us. Anyway, listen, thanks a million.
You're welcome.
Just before we go, we have our next talk on the 20th of March, which is 4 weeks from tonight, short month. Michael Talty from the Clare Library will be talking to us about a number of the new collections, the archive collections that Clare Library is working on and is cataloging. We're lucky enough now we have Michael, who is our senior librarian, but has also worked as an archivist for the RTE in previous jobs, as well as Kira Fahy, who's been appointed as an archivist for Clare County Council for the next 3 years. And the two of them are doing terrific work on the archives and cataloging a lot of the information. And Michael is going to be talking to us about what they found, what's been handed in, and some of the new collections. Okay, so it's 7:30, 20th of March next month, if you're interested in attending that. Okay, thanks very much, everybody, for coming.
Welcome.